The Armenian Genocide did not constitute these military engineers' first experience with massacres against Armenians. We must realize that many Baghdad Ban officers had years of experience in the Ottoman Empire before 1915. Some of the Baghdad Ban officers that were working on this project during the Armenian Genocide had also been working there during the Adana massacres in 1909. And not only had they then, in 1909, witnessed the Adana massacres, they had even been involved in rescue operations. The Baghdad Ban officer, Captain Heubusch, wrote a detailed diary during the Adana massacres. He says that on the 4th of April 1999, a Turkish officer contacted the German officers of the Baghdad Ban in the Adana area, saying that the Armenians had revolted and that they, the Armenians, now were looting shops and putting houses on fire. The next day, the 15th of May, the German officers suddenly heard shooting, and shortly thereafter a group of very scared Armenian women and children contacted them, begging for protection. The German engineer officers decided to act immediately. They loaded not less than 45 Armenian women and children into 3 large cars and evacuated them immediately. The diary of Captain Heubusch also gives us several details about the methods used to kill Armenians. Not an insignificant number of them were covered with petrol and burnt alive. Captain Heubusch was an experienced photographer and took pictures of Armenian women with these kinds of wounds. It is important not to forget these rescue episodes when discussing the role of the Baghdad Ban officers during the Armenian Genocide. In the years 1915 and 1916, the Baghdad Ban organization had years of experience in helping Armenians before the outbreak of the genocide. In the years between 1909 and 1915, a lot of Armenians were employed by the Baghdad Ban, thus giving them strong protection against eventual new massacres. Let us now turn on our attention towards the role of the Baghdad Ban officers 6-7 years later during the Armenian Genocide. During the first weeks of the genocide, we do not know any kind of spectacular actions performed by military officers working for the Baghdad Ban. But the officers did a remarkable job reporting about what they saw. Several detailed reports were sent to the central agency of the Baghdad Ban in Istanbul, where they were partly forwarded to the Deutsche Bank, who organized the finances of the project. The well-known initiative of Cemal Pasha, making it a crime to photograph Armenian deportees or dead Armenians, which by many scholars have been presented as a response to the activities of the German sanitary officer Armin Wegner, was in fact not directed against him, but against the photographing activities of Baghdad Ban officials. The Baghdad Ban employees, military and civilian alike, ignored the order of Cemal Pasha and continued photographing, and the first continuing the photographing documentation activities. The first direct intervention to save the lives of Armenians came in August 1915. Although these initiatives were not carried out by officers but civilian employees, they came to affect the military employees as well. Based on the reports and based on strong recommendations of the central agency of the Baghdad Ban, Deutsche Bank in August 1915 decided to transfer large amounts of money to be spread among Armenian deportees, and this had to be done in secret. The spreading of this money involved several engineer officers. These officers, many of them with years' experience in the area, were known for their good language skills. And this was not the case for other German officers. Some even could speak some Armenian, several could speak or at least understand Turkish. These officers now started employing Armenians to work for the company. In many cases, they were giving false Muslim names to reduce the danger of them being arrested by Ottoman authorities. These operations were on a large scale. Everything was done to confuse Ottoman authorities. Hilmar Kaiser has found several Ottoman documents confirming that Talat, Minister of the Interior, were investigating the pro-Armenian activities of the Baghdad Ban officers. In one document, according to Kaiser, it is stated that Baghdad Ban officers have been hiding 4,000 Armenians in the Amanus area alone. This came in addition to the approximately 3,100 Armenians formerly employed. In several cases where gendarmes were sent to collect and deport Armenians working for the Baghdad Ban, German engineer officers intervened so that the deportation could not be carried out. As you know, Archbishop Balakian was saved not at least as a result of the secret activities of German engineer officers. Some days, the later Archbishop himself even wore the uniform of a German engineer officer. When comparing the number of rescue initiatives among the rather limited number of engineer officers working in the Baghdad Ban and the rather few known such initiatives among the several hundred German officers in the standard military units, one must be astonished by the surprisingly high level of activity. The most strange explanations to this has been proposed as to say that these officers, the engineer officers, had a different socio-economical background than from the infantry officers, what should give them more empathy for the starving Armenians. I do not believe in such rubbish. I think the explanation is much easier. The Baghdad Ban was a completely German undertaking, and it was also an organization with a lot of resources. This entirely German community could plan and carry out spectacular rescue initiatives without being disturbed by Ottoman officials. One can compare this situation with a situation where one or perhaps two German staff officers are surrounded by 30, 40, 50 Ottoman officers, which was the case in a lot of military units. In the latter case, the room for maneuver in regard of helping Armenians was, needless to say, almost non-existent. Despite of this, some isolated German officers were able to perform rescue initiatives. One most extraordinary example is Kress von Kressenstein. Several such initiatives have been registered. In Aleppo, Kressenstein is the main architect behind the astonishing achievement that the Swiss missionary Beatrice Rohner was giving the permission to take over an orphanage with 400 Armenian children. Kress himself also gave a large amount of money from a military dispository fund to be spread among the Armenians of the Aleppo area. This sum equals the total amount of money transferred from the German ambassador Metternich to the humanitarian work of Beatrice Rohner throughout his 11 months serving as ambassador. This says very much about the true face of this, among many scholars, extremely idealized, yes, almost worshipped German ambassador. But it says even more about Major Kress von Kressenstein himself. Through all my years of research in this field, I think I have never found any German officer impressing me more than Kress von Kressenstein. But let us not reduce ourselves to function as agents for such kinds of idealizing projects. An explanation must be given. Everybody of you, or at least some of you, the one working in this field of research, I'm sure, have heard about, again and again, the close friendship between Hans Schumann and Enver Pasha. But there existed a similar, very close friendship between Kress von Kressenstein and Cemal Pasha. Not in all, but in many cases, the intervention of Kress was made possible by Cemal Pasha. In one specific case, Cemal Pasha even allowed Kress to give Armenian deputies money from Ottoman military funds, controlled by the Pasha himself. Some scholars have a somewhat naive image of Cemal Pasha, presenting him as a young Turk actively opposing the genocide. By studying at least the Austrian, Hungarian and the German diplomatic and military archives, we will see that almost all describe initiatives. So the order to return a group of Armenians that had been deported, this was only a statement of an order already given by Kressenstein. More work should be done on the activities of this officer. I'm quite sure that there is more to be found. Such research could also shed light on the role of Jamal Pasha himself. Liman von Sanders, this well-known German officer, constitutes a most disturbing case. It is impossible to categorize him according to a scale of pro or anti-Armenism. This single man has perhaps rescued more Armenians and Greeks than any other German officer. We will here focus on this, but we must not forget that the same man later supported the deportation of Greeks, knowing what he was doing. This demonstrates a somewhat astonishing fact. It's possible to save the life of thousands of Armenians without being driven by humanitarian motives. This being said, Liman's strong intervention for the Armenians of Izmir, then called Smyrna, is one of the most spectacular interventions performed by any German. Then Liman threatened civilian Ottoman authorities with use of military power to force through an immediate stop to the deportation of the city's Armenians, and he succeeded. During the 8th and during the night of November the 9th, 1916, the Valley of Smyrna, in a most surprising operation, deported 160 Armenians. Liman reacted immediately. He went to the Valley Rami Bey and said that he, as a commander of the 5th Army, would not tolerate any kind of deportation or massacres against the Armenians in this area. If this would not be respected, he would order his soldiers to arrest the policemen and gendarmes trying to deport the Armenians, and he would send the Armenians themselves back to their homes. He also threatened the Vali, saying that he was personally responsible for bringing the 160 Armenians safely back to the city from where they had been deported only a few hours before. Even though the Vali defended himself, saying that the deportation had been ordered by Talat Bey, Minister of the Interior, Liman forced the Vali to give in. He also promised to protect the Vali in an eventual conflict with the Minister of the Interior. Then he gave the Vali 4 hours to order the return of the 160 deported Armenians. The Vali had no other choice as to give in, and the 160 deported Armenians were returned to Izmir. This was the second time Liman von Sanders had intervened successfully to stop deportation. As we know from Austrian consular reports, Liman had saved the Greeks of Urla from being deported 8 months earlier. It is most likely that the deportation of the first group of 160 Armenians of Izmir was only the initiation of a whole-scale deportation of the 6,000 so Armenian population of the city. Based on an excellent research made by Ryan Gingeras and published in his book, Sorrowful Shores, Oxford University Press, 2009, it is most likely that those 6,000 Armenians would not only have been deported, but also killed. If all this is correct, we can conclude that Liman did not only save 160 Armenians from deportation, but even saved 6,000 from being killed. After this intervention, the Izmir Armenians stayed safely in the city until they were partly killed and partly were forced to flee in September 1922. If I should continue this listing of German officers performing help to Armenian deputies, we would not need 20 minutes but 1 hour. The role of Gerold Gleich in supporting the secret activities of Beatrice Rohner would have had to be mentioned. We would have had to focus on officers like Frey, who refused to disarm and get rid of Armenian officers in his staff. The many examples of German officers like Schraudenbach, who at several occasions gave private funds to Armenian deportees, would have had to be paid attention to as well. As the most confusing, ineffective, but energetic German military effort to stop massacres in Caucasus in 1918. In the last case, more research has to be done, as the available material is rather conflicting and demanding to analyze. Let me also suggest using the biographic books of Germans that experienced the Armenian genocide. Through 4 weeks in the German National Library, I was able to find more than 20 such biographical works written by German officers and ignored by genocide scholars. Not denying that such literature, written 10 or even 15 years later, and not seldom written partly to shape a good image of the activities of German officers in this regard, are not the kind of sources we historians tend to prefer. But we have to use what we've got. These 20 books include more than 500 pages describing German officers' reaction to massacres and deportation, of whom several were eyewitnesses. As the entire archive of the German military mission was destroyed in World War II, we really can afford to ignore this material much longer. Some conclusory remarks. What we have described are the activities of a few, although they are not as few as commonly thought. At least 10,000 Armenians must have been saved from death by the efforts of German officers. But compared to the number of victims, even this is a limited number. For a German officer to be able to help the Armenians, it seems like you either had to be a supreme commanding officer, like Liman von Sanders was, or you had to work inside a purely German organization, like the military engineers of the Baghdad Band were doing, or you would have to be on close terms with a high-ranking, influential Ottoman military or civilian official, like was the case for Kress von Kressenstein. We must never forget, when criticizing the German officers, the great majority of German officers did not belong to any of these groups. Thank you.